Welcome, grade 7, to our first ever video math lesson. I hope you had a good March break, and this will be one of the new ways that we are going to be doing our math lesson for the next little while. So today, we are going to start taking a look at percentages. So let's take a look, first of all, at that word percent. Now, I know all of you have worked a little bit with percentages. Maybe you've gotten a test back or a quiz back or an assignment back, and you get those numbers at the top, 21 out of 25. And so you want to know, well, what percentage is that? How did I do? And so in this unit, we're going to be taking a look at that. We're going to be learning today how to figure out that percentage in two different ways. And then we're going to figure out how we can work with part, percent, and whole to figure out some other missing values. So first of all, the word percent, we can think about it in two different ways, or two different words. We have the word per, and we have the word cent. And so the word per, if you were talking about kilometers per hour, or if you were talking about anything else that had that term in it, per just means out of. So how many kilometers out of every hour are you traveling? And the word cent, we see that word come up in centimeters, in century, and in a lot of other number-based words. The word cent refers to the number 100. So when we are talking about a percent, we're talking about a value that is out of 100. So let's try to figure out what that actually means. Now, to represent a percent, we use a symbol that looks like this. It has a circle at the top, a diagonal line, and a circle at the bottom. And so if I were to say that on a test, you got 45%. Hopefully you didn't get 45% on a test. But if you did, if we were to think about this word and expand it, percent, what this means is you really got 45 out of 100. So if there were 100 marks on the test, you got 45 of them correct. Out of 100, though, we can also write as a bit of a fraction. And so out of 100 is the same as over, 45 over, or out of 100 different parts. So just like that, going from a percent to a fraction can be very easy to do. All we have to do is put that number over 100. So if you had 75%, 75% as a fraction is 75 over 100. And as we learned in other units, we can actually simplify this, right? So 75 over 100 is not the fraction in simplest terms. I want to be able to reduce that by figuring out what can both go into 75 and 100 evenly. And the largest number that can do that is the number 25. So 25 goes into 75 3 times, and 25 goes into 100 4 times. So 75% as a fraction is 75 out of 100, which simplifies to 3 over 4. What happens if we have larger percentages? Well, let's take a look at that. So believe it or not, you can actually get percentages that are higher than 100. So let's say you had that same test, and instead of getting 45% on it, this next one, you not only knocked it out of the park, you not only got 100% on it, but you also got that bonus question that the teacher was asking. So now, instead, you got 110% on that test. 110% would be the same as 110 over or out of 100. And if we simplify that, this would simplify to 1 and 10 over 100, or 1 and 1 over 10. I could simplify things that way. So here we see how to go from a percent to a fraction. So let's take it the other way. Can we go from a fraction to a percent? Well, let's take a look. We're going to start off maybe with a little bit of an easier one. We're going to start off with the number 20 over 100. Anytime you see a fraction that's over 100, it makes it really easy to figure it out as a percent because it already is a percent. Right? How much is out of 100 in this question? And your answer is simply 20. So 20 out of 100 is 20%. What happens if it's not out of 100 yet, though? Okay, let's take a look at that example. What happens if instead we had, let's say you had 5 out of 20. There's another fraction. There's actually two different ways that we can solve this fraction. The first is it's not out of 100. Let's make it out of 100. In other words, how can we come up with an equivalent fraction, another term we used a lot last unit, for this fraction where our new denominator, that's the name of the bottom number here, is 100. What do I multiply this fraction by to get to that value? And if you take a look at the number 20, we need to multiply that by 5 in order to get it something over or out of 100. Whatever I do to the top, I have to do the same, or whatever I do to the bottom, I have to do the same to the top. So I end up with 25 out of 100, or 25%. Excellent. Let's take a look at another example that might be a little bit trickier. Let's take a look at 4 out of 15. Okay. Now, 4 over 15, if I were to do the same thing I did here and say, okay, well, what can I multiply it by to get over 100? Well, you might count up. You might say, okay, 15, 30, 45, 60, 75, 90, 105. So there isn't this whole number that we can multiply by to get there. And so that part doesn't really work this time around. Well, another way that we can work to get this as a fraction, or to get this as a percent, is actually to turn it first into a decimal. And the way that we do that is that a fraction is the same as a division question. So 4 over 15, or 4 out of 15, is the same thing as asking yourself, how many times does 15 go into 4? Or can I divide these two numbers together? And if you were to take these two values and you were to divide them together, you'd be able to get a decimal that then you could turn into a fraction. Now we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves because we started off by talking about percentages. We then went to fractions, and now we're starting to introduce decimals. And by the end of this video, my hope is that you can go back and forth between converting between percentages to fractions to decimals. 4 out of 15 might be a bit of a trickier one, but if you were to put that into your calculator, you'd be able to figure out what that is as an actual decimal place. Let's take a look at a decimal and see how we can convert it that way. So if I had 0.48, 0.48 is the number here. There's actually another way that I could say this number, say it properly, and that's using its proper place values. So the 4 is in the tenths column, the 8 is in the hundredths column. So we would say that this number is actually the same as 48 hundredths, or 48 hundredths. I can write it as a fraction, and then I can maybe better visualize how to work with this particular value or this particular number. Going from a decimal here to a fraction is a matter of figuring out what the final place value is, in this case hundredths, and putting this number without a decimal over that value. If I had a larger fraction here, 0.2469, in this case, we have tenths, we have hundredths, thousandths, 10,000ths. So this is 2469 over 10,000. And we can convert that pretty easily to a fraction. That might not be in simplest terms. We might have to work with this in simplest terms or find out if there's some way to reduce it. But at least this way, we can go from decimals to fractions. Now, how is it then that I can get my decimals into percents? Well, one way is to see if you can convert this in some sort of way so it's over 100. So here, we could take off 2 place values, move the decimal place over twice as well. We can see that this is the same as 24.69 over 100. Now, I would almost never recommend putting a decimal in a fraction, but by putting it over a 100, we automatically get the percent, 24.69%. We can then work with that number. We can then get a proper answer that way as well. An easy, cheat way of thinking about percentages when it comes to decimals is that if we have a decimal, let's say we have 0.946, all we have to do to turn this into a percent, move the decimal 2 spots over so that it's right after the hundredth spot. This is a percent is 94.6%. Let's say I had a different value. Let's say I had 0.302. Move it 2 spots over, and I get 30.2%. Okay, let's even try another one here. Let's try 1.4. Move it 2 spots over. You notice there's a gap here now, so I have to fill that gap in with a 0, and I get 140%. That's the number that's left after I've moved over the decimal. So this is kind of a nice cheat way, or an easier way to see how that particular question works. Let's take a look at some specific examples, see if we can figure them out as we go through solving this question. The first set of questions that we have here, we have as fractions, at least the first 2, and the last one is a decimal. And we're going to see if we can figure out how to turn this into a percent. So if you remember before, we kind of have 2 ways to do that. The first, 7 over 20. The first way that we can think about solving this would be to make this a fraction out of 100. So 7 over 20. Let's see if I can turn it into something over 100. And as we saw in the last question, I have to multiply by 5 to go from the 20 to 100. Do the same to the top. I get 35 over 100, or 35%. The second way to solve this question is to simply divide these 2 numbers together, to turn them into a decimal first, and then go from there. So we could say, how many times does 7 go into 20? Or sorry, how many times does 20 go into 7? It doesn't, you might say, and you're right. We need to get a decimal in order to solve that question. And so our decimal that we would have when we divide the 2 is 0.35. And in order to turn this into a percent, we move our decimal 2 spots over, or we times it by 100%. We want to think about it that way. And we get 35% as our final value. 2 different methods. Whatever way works for you, go with that. There might be some times where you might not be able to do the first method. So you have to go down to the second option. It's a good way, it's good to know both, as there will be some that are faster than others. The bottom one here you will always be able to use. This one you'll sometimes be able to use as a shortcut. Let's take a look at another example here, maybe a bit of a trickier one. 1 and 1 over 3. This time I have a mixed fraction. The first thing that I want to do with this improper fraction is to make it into a mixed number. In other words, I want to write this as one fraction, not as a whole number and a fraction beside it. And so our way of doing that, if you remember, we do the denominator times the whole number, 3 times 1, and add that to the numerator. So we end up with 4 over 3. Once I have this, it's just a matter of simply going through the rest of the steps. Now in this example, there's nothing that I can multiply 3 by to get to 100. So it makes it much more challenging to try to solve here. I can take this number and multiply it by 100%. And I can go through that result, or which will give me then 400 over 3. I could keep going with this question, and I could try to simplify this question as much as possible. And in this example here, that's this as a percent, it would give me roughly 133 and 1/3%. Another way that I could do it is I could simply divide these two together, and I would get a decimal value of 1.333, and that 3 actually repeats forever and ever and ever. So I'll have to do some rounding in this particular question. I multiply that by 100%, and I would get about 133.3, and I could put a line on top to show that it always repeats, or I can just round it off there, percent. Okay, well, let's take a look at the third one, where we already have it as a decimal. We need to make it as a percent. This one's probably the easiest one to be able to work with. All we do is we take the decimal, multiply it by 100%, or move the decimal 2 spots over in order to get our new value of 32.6%. That's this number with the decimal 2 spots over. Now that hopefully you have a grasp of turning things into percentages, let's go the other way. Let's start off with percentages and see if we can change those into both fractions as well as into decimals. The fraction part, if you remember, is really nice and easy. We take the number that's already there and just put it over 100. So 0.5 over 100 would be our answer here. Now, we do not like having decimals in our fractions. I know we showed that before. We don't like that, so let's try to get that out of there. If we move the decimal spot 1 place over here, or in other words, times the top by 10, we have to do the same to the bottom. And so this would actually give us a fraction of 5 over 1,000 instead. That way we have no decimals in it. They're equivalent fractions to each other, so we can do that. In order to turn this into a decimal, all I have to do is divide these two values, and I would get the answer of 0.005 when I divide those. So this is it as a fraction, this is it as a decimal. Let's take our next number here, 238%. To figure this out as a fraction, I simply put it over or out of 100, and then I could even simplify this and say it's same as 238 over 100, and you can keep going with simplifying so that you have this in simplest terms. Our next step to get this as a decimal would be simply to divide the top by the bottom, to divide these two values here, and I would get the value of 2.38. So there you have it. We're able to go back and forth, hopefully now, between a percent, a fraction, and a decimal.